Good morning, everybody. Good morning. So this is, as General Swan said, an important discussion as we focus our attention on Army contracting and how smart Army contracting reform can enable Army readiness. I'd like to add my thanks to AUSA not only for organizing these hot topics, but focusing this one on Army contracting, and more importantly, for all they do for soldiers and families in our Army every day. So, General Swan, General McQuistion, and all of the AUSA team, thank you so much. As we heard in the opening comments, and so far this morning, we recognize that contracting plays a vital role. They provide enablers for our units, they modernize our weapons and equipment, and they deliver essential services to our soldiers and families, which is key to this panel. Smart contracting reform is vital as we move forward. So this panel has been asked to focus on how we can reform service contracting and implement category management. AUSA has assembled a really well-rounded panel here who bring both unique experience and responsibilities that give them an informed perspective to add to this discussion. So we look forward to sharing those perspectives with you, and more importantly, we look forward to hearing from you and getting your questions. So let me introduce our panel in the order in which they will give a short opening remarks and then be prepared for your questions. First, as already introduced, our panel chair, Major General James E. Simpson, who currently serves as the Commanding General, United States Army Contracting Command. He'll be followed by Miss Ellen Helmerson, the Deputy Chief of Staff in G8 for Resource Management, United States Army Training and Doctrine Command. Then Mr. Byron Bright, President, Government Services, KBR Incorporated. Following him be Mr. Darren Kraabel, Senior Vice President for Aerospace and Technology at Jacobs Engineering Group Incorporated. And then closing out the opening remarks, Brigadier General Michael Hoskin, who's the Director for Contracting at the Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. So, well-rounded panel, all with unique experiences. Look forward to what they have to offer and to your questions. I'll turn it over to Major General Simpson.
Good morning, and to General Ham and to the AUSA staff. Certainly thank you for inviting me back again. And to Ms. Hugh, it's always good to see you. But let me say, in my opinion, I think the service contracting business drives our Army. Last year, we obligated about $78 billion in contracts. $48 billion of it went to service contracting. First slide, please, okay? And if you look at that slide up there, service contracting supports our Army in 3 different domains. And I would say 2 weeks ago, I had the pleasure of going down to what we call the Great Place. Many of you know that as Fort Hood, Texas. Okay, and when you look at about $12 billion supported the facilities and related service, support our soldier families and garrisons, Fort Hood, Fort Bragg, so forth and so forth. And then about $7.8 billion supports what we do downrange, whether that's Iraq, Afghanistan, so forth, dining facilities, fuel contracts, mail services, lodging, language translators, and so forth. And then when you look at what we do in science and technology, base services, that's about a whooping $25 billion, right? That's globally. It's a lot of money supporting of service contracting. Now, why do we contract for services? We rely on service contract providers to supplement, support, and enhance the capabilities and capacity of the Army. We don't have this huge service support Army that we had back in the 70s and 80s. We cut that. So it doesn't matter where we got what we're doing now with service contracts, we will probably be doing it for a long, long time. Whether that's in the Pentagon with people supporting different tasks in the Pentagon, or downrange, or on these major installations. The Army this allows our Army to focus more on readiness and our soldiers to do what they do best, go out and fight our nation's wars. Next slide, please. Since about January, I've had the pleasure of, and I don't know whether I call it a pleasure or not, but me and Mr. Hazlett and General Hoskins have been in a lot of meetings in the Pentagon talking about service contract reforms. And, when you come out of those meetings, you're a lot shorter than when you went in. And sometimes when I'm flying back to Huntsville, I look over and look out the window of the plane, I want to cry a lot. So, but we are doing a lot in the service to be more efficient, so that we can, and I'll give you a good example. Stuart talked about strategic data analysis cell earlier. When we came out of one of the meetings with the DUSA back in January, he said, James, can you guys set up a strategic data analysis cell? Stuart talked about data, about metrics. We seeing ourselves, and we got that cell set up in Huntsville, but working with Stuart and his team also, where we are putting a lot of data now, getting it back to the Pentagon, where we all can be on the same sheet of music to make sure we are all driving toward the same objective. And you know that they're talking about, savings about, $1.2 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. So we're trying to collect data, but we're also trying to put the right contracting vehicles in place. Many of you know in the service contracting on, say, I'll take Fort Bragg, for instance. You got a lot of little small contracts on these installations. Do we need all these small contracts? Because every time you got a contract, that means you got to have a COR in place, and we talked about CORs earlier today and everything. Or can we do some consolidation somewhere? So we're looking at that. The next bullet, detailed contract and requirement scrub. I think General Volmaker earlier today talked about requirements and ever-changing requirements. And if we don't get the requirement right, then that affects the proposal that we get in from industry. And we have to work as a team, and Mr. Sard talked about more transparency in the solicitation process and everything. So we're working hard to make sure that we're all nested on the requirement side of the house, because I can tell you, we have got to get the requirement right. And I think that is where we can find a huge savings if we get the requirement right, and we just move from telling the contractors how to do it and go to a performance-based approach, okay? And the goal is to achieve significant sustainable reductions in net contract costs. Bullet number 3, strategic sourcing. I think we got Log Cap, Eagle, Oasis out there, moving to these strategic sourcing vehicles. We got a number of strategic sourcing vehicles out there. And as we move toward those vehicles, we want to make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck. That means that we don't have to put all these ones and twos contracts in place. We can cut task orders off of these vehicles, so forth and so forth. And we talked about developing better requirements, customers training, standardizing requirements, packages. But in order to develop better requirements, the requiring activity, contracting, and industry must work left. We had to get it together up front, 6, 7, 8 months out and working these requirements instead of coming together at the last minute to work them. We find out when we come to get together at the last minute and try to work requirements, it doesn't work, okay? We just mess them up. And we've had a history of where we tried to throw requirements together at the last minute, where all you see once you award the contract is, guess what, a lot of modifications down the road where it's costing the government and it's costing you down the road too. A lot of modifications. Okay. And then talk about targeting training on the procurement process enable success. Stuart talked about talent management and how do you manage the workforce, but my concern is from a contract and offer perspective is that we got to make sure that we do a better job of training our contracting personnel to be more flexible, more agile, and looking at different contracting methods and different ways of doing business. Contracting is a complex process, but we have to train. I got about of a 6,300 person workforce, and 99% of that workforce is 1102 contracting professionals. Now, again, some of them are more trained than others. Some of them are in the middle, and then we got a large percentage that we're bringing along. But all of them are good people, but there's still a huge gap in the training that we have to make sure that they understand the complexities of contracting. And I will leave it at that for my opening comments. One other one I think I want to talk about POLT, though. I think Stuart talked about that one. Procurement acquisition lead time. That's a tough one. We've got metrics out there, but in order for us to decrease procurement acquisition lead time, it takes industry, contracting, and the requiring activity working together. I think General Vollmeck mentioned some of the things that he's doing, but it takes those commanders involved in the process and looking at those requirements and making sure that is the right requirement. And then when it get over to my contracting people, it takes me, to a certain extent, and those directors at their level and those division chiefs, micromanaging those packages and make sure they don't just sit on the desk, but pushing them out and getting them awarded. Thank you.
Thanks, General Simpson. Ms. Helmerson.
Good morning, everybody. General Swan, Ms. Jude, thank you very much for being here and inviting me to participate. So you're probably wondering, I'm not a contracting official and I'm not with industry, so what am I? I am the other part of the triangle, right? I am the requiring activity, the one who requires industry participation in order to meet our mission. But as a resource manager, I am also critically involved in stewardship to ensure that we are describing the work in the right place, we're putting the right guidance in place, we're ensuring from a requirement side, can we describe that work in a performance-based way? So I don't say who I want, I say what I need as an outcome to achieve. So today I want to share with you inside Tradoc, the Training and Doctrine Command, contracting is critical to us meeting our mission readiness. 1/2 of our budget goes to contracting. So as the steward, or the responsible steward, I need to make sure that we are getting those right outcomes, and I want to share with you some of the ways and means that we are using in order to achieve that. So firstly, I have 3 goals, and one is to ensure contracting accountability, one is to enrich visibility of acquisition, and the last one is to enable affordability of acquisition. So first of all, I will tell you that we have a very good policy in place in our command that every one of our commanders and their staffs are held to, that tells them what they have to do inside our requirements documents, when they have to do it, because we don't want to be that last one, shoot it at the last time and let's wait a year. That's not going to meet the requirements of our command. So putting that policy in place and sharing that with our other commands to kind of give them ideas what can work. How can we ensure that we are describing performance-based requirements, and what is the approval process for all those documents? Because they just don't go from that local requiring activity to the Army Contracting Command. There is a vetting process to ensure our senior commanders at the center level or at my level are reviewing those documents and making sure they are ready, they are prepared to go to contracting and be successful. One of the means that we're taking place right now is not everybody does a great job developing those requirements. I think you all know that, right, as you see them. So we are actually piloting a tool. We're developing a tool that will take really good performance work statements and really good quality assurance statements and pull them into a system and allow those people that are writing new requirements to pull from that system and actually get a good start on putting new requirements in place. So if I'm trying to hire instructors, right, at one location, and I have 17 other contracts for instructors, why can't they go to those contracts, pull the right pieces in, use that, and then modify it? It will save time, it will improve accuracy, and I believe it will save money if I do it that way. The other thing we're trying to do, and I know I asked a question to Ms. Chu earlier, is on CORs. So from the requirement side, that COR plays a critical role ensuring that they are engaging with industry, that they are providing feedback both to industry and to the contracting command to make sure that we are getting the outcomes or outputs that we need, and to provide guidance and insight when it's needed to enable that. So it's very important. And so for this year, the initial training is really good, but it's really not enough. And we need to make sure that they are tied to their commanders, that they are providing feedback on a timely manner, on an accurate manner, so that we're getting the right source, because that will also inform what comes next, what kind of contract comes next. So in visibility, one of the tools, and I think I talked about it a little bit last year, was we developed a Tradoc contract database. I can see every contract in Tradoc as it is developed. I can see all components of it. I can understand the risk if it is not awarded, the timing for it. I share that with Army Contracting Command, because I can share it with my financial system, so I can tie the contract need to money, and I can tie that to the VCE that General Simpson is developing. So both our sides can get all that data. They can see where we are on money. They can understand what's going on with the requirement side, and I can see what's going on from the contracting side. Good visibility on that. But one of the key things is that relationship, right? That relationship between the requirement activity and the contracting activity is critical. And not everybody steps in on that, but it is critical to making sure they understand what we need, we understand what we have to give them in order to deliver that, and we work together to work with industry in order to get those right outcomes. So I think it is a really critical thing. Lastly, in the affordability, of course, it becomes about money, right? Are we asking for the right thing? Are we describing it in the right way? But can we be more efficient in what we're doing with contracts? Can I combine small contracts into a bigger contract? Can I do that at a local level? Can I do it at a regional level? Can I do it with some of my other command partners that maybe we have to buy the same thing in MCOM that I need to buy? Can I use that same contract? So we're looking for ways and means to kind of reform our process to ensure that we do a better job there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Mr. Bright.
Thank you. Thank you, General Simpson. Thank you, AUSA, for the invitation. I feel like I should have been on the last panel. I think a lot of the comments we heard really resonated with me. Mr. Hazlitt talked a lot about talent and how we manage. Jeff Parsons talked about, the lessons learned of the past and making sure we're supporting our KOs. And General Velmek, he talked a lot about being careful of these global IDIQs and really tailoring solutions and being agile. And so I'll hit on some of those points in my opening comments, but really I'm going to focus around people. And this panel is about category management, and my question would actually be to challenge that statement. Should service contracting even be a part of category management? And KBR Wiley has a unique perspective on this matter, as we're a pure services firm in that we don't manufacture product or software, hardware or software. We have over 14,000 professionals that work across a diverse set of services, from logistics, systems engineering, space operations, and I can tell you there's no two contracts are alike. Some of the categories of services we would provide are things like providing pilots for experimental test flights, operating mission control and ground network stations, sitting console 24/7 monitoring satellites, building base camps in Eastern Europe or Iraq, designing data algorithms for the Patriot missile system. It just goes on and on of the types of services that the Army and other services buy, and it's very difficult to just call those one thing. Typically in the commercial world, when we talk about category management, we're referring to major commodities. Maybe it's steel, concrete, tires, fuel. And the theory is that, with these homogeneous kind of categories, you can have procurement teams that are buying for the entire global enterprise, which should drive down prices and get a better value. And I just question if that works in the services industry, because people are not a commodity. And I think that's really important to realize, that the government is in competition for talent. Some of the unintended consequences, I think, of treating services as a homogeneous broad category include treating professionals as a commodity, using things like LPTA, or even when it's not LPTA, it's price-focused acquisition strategies drive down wages. At the end of the day, you're buying talent in the Army. In the fields of cybersecurity, software development, aerospace engineering, the best talent has other options. They're going to go to Google, Facebook, Amazon, and we need, for the national security of this country, we need to bring in the best talent. But it's not just the high-tech industries. Even in Army logistics, to get employees to go overseas and work in remote and harsh environments, they have other options as well. They can go work for ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, performing very similar duties in the Middle East and Africa. So there are options out there for this talent-based workforce, and I think as an industry we need to really be guarded against some of these high competitions where you just continue to drive down wages. I think it's also important to look in the service contracting to look at the operational environment where these services are being performed. If you're providing kind of typical 9-to-5 engineering services, maybe here in the DC area, then maybe having a very high small business content might make sense. But if you're providing some mission critical service overseas, or even what we do in Charleston where we're doing pre-positioned stock, it's very schedule driven, very mission focused driven. We actually have 39% small business requirement on that contract. That's costly, that's disruptive, and I wonder why that goal was set. Was there a specific reason for that? And sometimes I think it's just these blanket goals or blanket contract types that drive us to some of these unintended consequences when we look at services as a single category. To reform service contracting, I would recommend that we stop thinking about the broad categories or attempts to really centralize, and I really think it comes back to people. I think the government needs to invest in their people, developing teams that really understand the user requirements and the environment they're going to be worked in. Stop forcing some of these global IDIQs that set rigid labor schedules. We need to empower our contracting officers and create these agile procurement teams. Mandating specific procurement approaches such as small business goals or specific contract type really oversimplifies what we do in services. Our world is more diverse, it's faster, it's complex than just a single category. I think training and empowering the local contracting professionals to make true business decisions is really what's going to drive better outcomes for the warfighters. And then we have to empower them, and we have to create a regulatory and oversight framework that is supportive of that autonomous business decisions. They're often making real-time decisions with limited information, and then we go back 5 and 10 years later through audits and other things, and we question those decisions. And I think that's unfair to those local contracting officers. And as a community, we need to support them and empower them to make those decisions, and then stand by them when they have the courage to do that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Mr. Kraabel.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm going to just piggyback, I think, on a lot of the things that Byron said, as well as the other panelists here, as well as the first panel, because like Byron, I almost felt like there were so many good salty points that were brought up there from all perspectives around acquisition reform, particularly focused on service contracting, that they're worth. It's probably nice, maybe it was intended that it worked out that way, but it's nice to be able to reemphasize some of those. I'm going to take a little bit different approach than Byron did, where he was focusing on the people and whether or not you can fit people into categories. I would agree with everything that Byron said in that regard, and I think that's maybe a bit misled on our joint way here. But what you see behind me is a set of, these are Jacob's core values, and I'm not trying to give you a core value lesson here or anything like that, but there's a point here, and so just bear with me. Every company has these core values, especially in the service industry, and they're very similar, and not just saying one set of values is better than another, but in the services industry in particular, I would be surprised if there was a company out there that didn't have some core value that focused on the importance of our clients, and that probably seems obvious, and the way that they articulate those values may seem relatively benign. In our case, we've chosen to state our value as clients are our valued partners. And that, again, may seem benign, but I want to call your attention to that word partner, because that's fundamentally important to how we approach the way that we engage with clients and the way that we make business decisions on whether we bid or not bid and what we choose to invest in and what we choose not to invest in. And I think at the heart of that is if a partnership requires mutual multi-party, in most cases 2 parties, but some cases it's 3. It could be the industry, the contracting command, as well as the end user, requires commitment on all those parties. And I think we as a joint community focused on solving warfighter problems have lost our way a little bit in that regard. And the reason I say that is like Byron and just about everybody in this room probably used to be on the other side of the buying table. And I remember, and maybe it's because I'm remembering it through rose-colored glasses, I don't know, but I remember a different sort of environment where when I was talking to my support contractor, my service contractor, it was a very much free to engage in a conversation about a problem. They could come to me with a problem and know that as long as we were working on a solution and got to a solution, that things were everybody was going to be treated fairly and appropriately, and they didn't have that fear coming to me. And I think the reason we found our way here is that acquisition reform for all the important of focusing on requirements development and speed to acquisition, most of the acquisition reform initiatives are focused on buying things faster and cheaper. And in service contracting, that's a problem, because in a product or commodity world, that works because when you buy something, the transaction is pretty much done at that point, right? The contract is the culmination of that, pending warranty and schedule and those kinds of things. For service contracting, it's just the opposite. That contract award is the first step in a relationship. And the government is buying a relationship. Industry is proposing. It's very much like a marriage proposal in some respects. And if you just stopped at the altar and said, okay, we're done, now we're married, we all know that if you don't continue to invest in that relationship, something's probably not going to go right. And I think there's lots of areas where we probably need to emphasize, but acquisition reform typically fails to address that. I think that's a really big area of focus that needs to be addressed relative to service contracting. And I think within there, we talk about the importance of the CORs, and they're very important. A lot of times users and the CORs don't understand what makes industry, what incentivizes industry. It's a business acumen discussion. They don't understand what drives our decisions on whether we bid or not bid. How do we get how do we quantify value? It's not all about money. It's about, can I use this contract as past performance later on, assuming I do good work? Do you pay your bills on time? And while the government is typically a good bill payer, there's a lot of times, I think Byron would attest this, where we're putting millions of dollars at risk. We know you're going to pay the bill, but there's a cost of capital in our business that our bosses talk to us about, and it's not necessarily a complicated financial concept to get at, but there's more about return on investment from our part than just the financial return on that. And we have to figure out a way to educate everybody so that we can sit across the table and have fair, open, transparent discussions when those when something goes a little bit south.
Thank you. General Hoskin.
Yes, General Ham, General Swan, General McQuistion, Ms. Hugh. First and foremost, thanks for inviting me to this panel. I think it's important just to put a little bit of context in place on service contracts. I was honored, and so was General Simpson, by the way. He was in charge of LogCap 3 in Iraq and 4 and 5, and I was in charge of LogCap 3 and 5 and 6. So pretty comfortable, familiar with working with large service contracts. On my chart here, I just put this up just to give you an idea on acquisition reform, how many different initiatives are actually out there and kind of what's going on with that. But I'd like to touch on a couple comments that different folks made. With General Simpson, I'd like to just kind of thank him for setting the stage on what is the size and the scope of service contracts. And Ms. Helmerson and Tradoc, the tools that you just discussed is really going to lead the Army in strategic sources and also category management. I'll touch on category management a little bit more at the very end, but for industry partners, this is really important. You really need to kind of focus on where the Department of Defense is going in category management because we're going to have longer, larger contracts and solicitations coming out. A couple of the acquisition reform efforts. So the first one, Army Acquisition Reform, XORD. XORD is executive order. And number 5 is actually kind of tied to that. And that's where the senior leadership of the Army kind of wanted to see kind of where we are with acquisition or procurement lead time and where they want us actually to be. So Ms. McFarland, who was the ASALT at the time, she signed number 5, the contracting memo implication. And what she was really saying is this is going to be the standards that we're going to be held to for PALT and for other functions within contracting. Probably the largest reform effort right now is the Senate 809 panel that Mr. Hazlitt talked a little bit about in the last panel. So it's made up of about 18 very, very, very senior, very experienced folks that are called commissioners. I'm the most junior on that. And, but it's folks that have been working 30, 40, 50 years in this kind of field. And so about 25 years ago, we had this thing called the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. And revolutionized, kind of how we're going to do contracting, especially for simplified and micro and things like that. So this is kind of like FASA reborn. And it's a 2-year effort. We've given the first report back to the House and the Senate last January. We have another 2 of 3 that's going back to the House and Senate next month, and then the final report with all of our recommendations this upcoming January. So some of the recommendations and things we're working on today from a human capital, from a talent management perspective, some of the Army's acquisition core is under a system called Acquisition Demonstration, or ACDemo. Others are under different systems, like the GS or General Services. And we're going to propose that the entire acquisition core be part of ACDemo. It gives us more flexibilities in being able to provide bonuses to our best and our brightest performers. So that's one of them we're looking at. Other things we're looking at is that if things are purely commercial, then should they be even FAR-based contracts? And no dollar threshold. So this group meets about 5 or 6 times a month, and we're working through everything from people to processes to clauses and provisions, what still makes sense, what does not. The OSD DPAP Regulatory Reform Task Force, RRTF, very interesting. So OSD decided that they should do like a spring cleanup, which is going to take a whole year. But the spring cleanup is really looking at the DFARS, or the Defense Supplement to the Federal Acquisition Regulation. Look at the entire thing, soup to nuts, everything. And right now there's currently 350 clauses and provisions that are within the DFARS. And so we're biting at that 10 to 20 every 2 weeks. And we do a deep dive. Major General Casey Blake, myself, our Navy counterparts, Elliot Branch, and DPAP, Shea Assad and his team, we meet for hours every 2 weeks, every Friday, or every other Friday, and we go through and we make decisions on retain, remove, or modify. And I'll tell you, we were, part of our guidance was go big or go home. So we're recommending the removal or modifying of about 50%, to the point where the DepSecDef sent a message down to us saying, "Are you really sure you want to go this far?" And so we explained our rationale while we went through them. And if the clause of the provision was aligned to a particular entity, like maybe transportation and Transcom, we had experts from Transcom weigh in. If it had to do with engineering and construction, we went to USACE, to the Corps of Engineers, had them weigh in on if this makes sense or not. So we're about 50% through this. Most of these changes or removals is going to require a legislative change proposal, and same thing with the 809 panel. But I will tell you that this is good timing for all of this, both the House and the Senate, and also our Department of Defense leadership all sees this as a challenge that we need to fix. Let's see what else I'll touch on here. Commercial buying site initiative. There's there's one in particular, but you think eBay, Amazon, companies like that. There's been a pretty big press for the not just the Army, but the Department of Defense to use more and more of those kind of commercial sites. I had to do some analysis on that to talk to Army leadership. So the Army right now has 30,000 GPC cards or credit cards that are issued to all over the world to our forces. Of the 30,000, about 8,000 folks actually use those cards to purchase on those type of sites. And we actually get pretty good deals on it. Right now, last year was about 25 million. So you may see a little bit more initiative on that. I think GSA has been tasked to put a contract together so that the services can use that. I'm a little bit over time, so I'll finish up really quick. I did a Google search of the term acquisition reform, and there's 99,800 hits. So this is a very popular target. And and then I want to leave you with category management. General Blake, Mr. Hazlitt, and a number of other people have mentioned that. I heard what Mr. Bright was talking about, but don't completely concur. When we have every single small little shop writing their own contracts and writing their own performance work statements, at times we're not leveraging the expertise. So I think the Army and the other services are going to be going more and more in the near future to having small areas of brilliance and expertise to write service contracts, to write commodity contracts. I think you're going to see more and more of that. So why is this important to you, industry? Because we're going to be putting MATOCs, multiple award IDIQ contracts on the street. And so pay attention, because they're going to be longer term than you're used to. So if you're awarded in this, then your potential for future work is there. Instead of having thousands of individual contracts for the same kind of either service or commodity. And with that, off the stage.
Well, actually not, because the first two questions really come in very much related to your last comment. I'm going to give you a chance. They came in for you and for General Simpson, but like for all questions that come to the panel, I'm going to encourage panel members to respond with their perspectives, even if they weren't specifically addressed. But this first one is going to give you a chance to continue talking about category management, and it's written from a small business perspective with the question of how do you go to that without negatively impacting small businesses who are not necessarily able to compete the same way under category management. Shouldn't we have a balance of unique services on smaller contracts and achieve some sort of balance to alleviate the criticism that you get with larger service contracts? So first to you, and then General Simpson, and then to the rest of the panel as you wish.
Okay, so I think we're talking apples and oranges here, because many of our MATOCs, multiple award IDIQ contracts, a lot of them are divided up into a pool of small businesses and a pool of other than small businesses. And so, for example, the chess contract. The chess contract is a contract that we have in place to buy many of our IT products. And it's kind of important that we kind of screen the vendors and screen the products for cybersecurity reasons. So that's one of the main reasons why we have this big MATOC in place for computers and routers and things like that. So if you have a requirement, you can look on the small business piece of chess, or the other than small business piece of chess, which is open to everybody, to make your decisions on how you want to do your contracting or your acquisition strategy. So I don't believe that putting a MATOC in place equals that small businesses can't compete. Jim Simpson?
But thank you. Let me say this also. There are many small businesses opportunities. The Missing Installation Contracting Command that works for me, stationed down in San Antonio, they got 32 installations spread out in the continental United States, the Fort Drums of the world, Fort Braggs, and so forth. Around those installations, there are many small opportunities for small businesses. And as Mike said also, for these larger contracting vehicles that we put in place, many of them have opportunities for small businesses too. But when I think about small businesses, what is the capability that you're trying to bring to the table that is going to help our Army? You can't just say you're a small business. What's the capability that's going to support Army readiness? That's what you have to look at. Likewise with our large businesses. What is the capability that you're bringing to the table?
Okay, we're going to stay with this theme because I get several more questions going this way, but I'm going to ask them because they're each a little bit different in their question and may generate a slightly different response. So the first is a little bit more general and may help us get after this discussion, and it asks specifically, how does category management differ from strategic sourcing? And can you provide examples of some of the current service contracts which might be aligned with category management?
Well, I would say that category management and strategic sourcing are kind of linked together. if you think about some of the larger contracts we have, some of them are worldwide, some of them are regional in nature. The Air Force just recently, for example, they put into play, they saw that they had a challenge with roofing, of all things. And so they put a policy out that if you're going to replace roofs on buildings on an Air Force base, then you're going to use this performance work statement that we've already competed and we've already awarded. And oh, by the way, you can't do it until the useful life of the roof is up, not just because you have some money at the end of the fiscal year. And so they standardized their performance work statement for that, and they put a policy in place explaining how it's supposed to be used. So I don't know if you'd consider worldwide roofing contract strategic sourcing or not, but it seems to work for them, and they are claiming pretty significant savings since putting that up. Another strategic source or decision really that the Air Force made recently, which we may need to think about across the Army, was they decided that it'd be smart to invest some MILCON up front and replace every single light on every single runway with LEDs. So you're going to have an initial spend to do all of that, but the amount of electricity that you save, the break-even point is not very long. So the Army, we're also teaming with the Air Force and looking at different things. Ms. Halverson, do you have anything you want to add to this,
Yeah,
strategic sourcing?
Right. So I think that we're thinking the same thing, even inside. So even if it's not from an enterprise perspective, but it's inside a coalition like all of FORCECOM, all of AMC, all of IMCOM, there are ways and means that we should be doing the same thing. Can we establish standard performance work statements that, for my case, I need instructors, right? And it doesn't matter if I need an infantry instructor or a logistics instructor. Those would change in the contract, but the contract's pretty much the same. What I need instructors to be able to do, how they have to deliver their experience. So it is, we do categorize our contracts. I can see them we have 9 major categories that we have contracts in. And so I think it's important that we can get to that point and leverage it. And if we can put contracts in place and leverage a contract and use task orders, it's going to save time, it's probably going to save money, and it's going to build a stronger relationship with industry, I believe.
If I could just add on to the discussion, I think, the reason I tried to be a little controversial about should services be category management, I do think you're exactly right. There are some great best practices, and we should create some centers of excellence for different kinds of services. My fear is we begin to lump services into commodities, and that was really the point of my opening. Is I don't believe services are a commodity. When you're on a weapon system or you're doing something that directly supports the warfighter downrange, that's a different kind of service than roofing or other LED lights or whatever. So I just think we have to be careful because the category of services is huge. And I think we need to really think about, empowering our contracting officers to work with the requiring activity to really think about what they're trying to get. It goes back to that performance-based contracting and writing the right kinds of statements of work. Now, I do think as a category, we should have some best practices. We should have some, centralized databases and examples so that we're giving the tools and the resources to the local contracting officers so they're not having to recreate the wheel every time. So I think there's a balance, I think, between category management and one-size-fits-all. And I guess that's my warning, is we have to be very careful that we don't fall into services is one-size-fits-all, because it's really not. And I think, as I said, I tried to give a snapshot of the diversity that I deal with in my company, and it's amazing. I mean, from literally cooking eggs out in the middle of nowhere in Iraq to, launching satellites. The diversity that we provide, and it's all under this kind of knowledge-based service. And so I think it's really important that we can be agile, and we can create, agile procurement teams that have the right tools with the right benchmarks and the right, examples of best practices that they can pull from, but then empower them to make those business decisions and tailor the actual contract type, the incentives, the labor schedules to whatever that end performance-based delivery they're trying to get.
Yeah, maybe just one more point. So both Byron and I are actually former Air Force officers, so we find it a little bit funny that we're sitting here. But I agree with what you said, Byron, and also that we need some centers of expertise and be able to leverage those best practices. But at the risk of being a little controversial against my service alma mater, the things that have gone on, the things that they have achieved in service contracting and category management on the service side in the Air Force, I don't think we're not hypothesizing about a slippery slope toward commoditizing people. That's actually happening. And I think the consequences of that are starting to be felt across the Air Force portfolio. I don't necessarily think the sky is going to fall in immediately, but there are real world examples of where that, I'm going to buy an IT guy and a PC technician, and regardless of where it is, that guy is $20 an hour or whatever. That's not obviously the right number, but that is where category management has gone to on the Air Force side, and quite frankly, that's not a very mutually beneficial business environment for anybody. And I think you're starting to see companies make decisions, mine included, about whether that's an environment where we think we can really contribute to the mission given those constraints.
So this must be a complex subject because there's no such thing as a short question. I want to read this one just because it captures really it's a long question, but it's a good one, and I'm going to open it to General Simpson and General Hoskin first, and then I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel. And it distinguishes strategic sourcing from category management, as it asks, as you move towards strategic sourcing vehicles, such as OASIS, how can mid-sized companies with valuable services provide those to the Army if they don't hold or qualify for those vehicles which strongly favor long-standing, very large government contractors or very small businesses versus companies that have either a specific focus or a mix of government and commercial clients? And then a comment here, the current model and the move towards larger, longer contracts seems counter to Honorable Jetty's repeated statement of growing the population of companies that want to do business with the Army beyond the current 5K out of the 23 million U.S. firms. So, question for first General Simpson and then General Hoskin, and then I'd like to hear from the rest of the panel. I think really that it was important to me to get the whole crux of it, but really what the question is you go to strategic sourcing, there are companies who are on those vehicles, and mid-sized companies or others who are not on those vehicles are therefore not able to compete for the task orders. How do you reconcile that with a desire to get more companies in the mix?
Okay, first of all, strategic sourcing vehicles, we have to find a delicate balance, okay? They're not the end-all and the be-all. As Ms. Hsu talked this morning about OTAs and their impact on small businesses, okay. There are some strategic sourcing vehicles out there, for instance, log cap, downrange. That vehicle right there supports all of our soldiers downrange. And there are only, maybe 5 or 6 different companies that is working log cap right now. For small, and some of them got subs with mid-tier subs and smaller contracts that are working for them. But when you're talking about these huge strategic sourcing vehicles, yes, the question is, it's a good question. It is difficult if you're a mid-sized company and you trying to get on one of those vehicles. That's why I said we have to find a balance here. I think that the strategic sourcing vehicles that we got in place currently, log cap, Eagle, and some of the other vehicles, gets at what the Army is trying to get at in terms of meeting our readiness and enabling readiness and so forth. And some of those, unfortunately, some of those vehicles are hard to get to when there's been long-standing organizations out there that have the know-how and so forth to compete on those vehicles. And that's just being totally transparent. Mike?
Yeah, I concur with General Simpson. Just a couple of points, though. When I talked about some of the MATOCs having some contracts or task orders set aside for small businesses, I didn't say the rest of them are for large businesses. I said they were for other than small businesses. And that's not subtle, that's the truth. So if you're a mid-size or a large or a small, you can compete on that other portion of that MATOC. So the question is your company kind of prepared to do that? You have to answer that one yourself. But within contracting, within that Federal Acquisition Regulation, one of the probably most important aspects is fairness. So we're going sideways trying to ensure that we're being fair and as open to industry as we possibly can. I will tell you that Dr. Jetty's comments about 5,000 contractors versus 23 million available, I think the barriers to entry is all the bureaucracy that we have. You know, it just, when I've got a couple of friends of mine I grew up with that own their own businesses, and a couple of them have come to me and said, hey, what does this mean? You know, they're pulling out a clause in a contract. And I'm trying to explain it to them. Well, some of these companies are like 2 and 3 people. They can't do it the way that our bureaucracy is currently set up. That's why that chart I had up there had 9 acquisition reform initiatives. That's why we're trying to clear the brush. We're trying to get rid of a lot of clauses, provisions, rules that may not really apply, especially if you're talking about a commercial or a commercial-like kind of product or service. So there's a big effort underway to streamline as much as we can to break down those barriers to entry.
I'd say a related question, and again, I'll let Mr. Bright answer it as well. But as you transition to this strategic sourcing, how do you manage those left behind who may not already be on that? Sure, they might be able to compete the next time it comes up, but in the meantime, if they aren't already on it, how do you transition and accommodate them as well? First, General Hoskin, and then back to you, Mr. Bright.
So on most of these MATOCs, and actually one of them that was brought up was OASIS. When OASIS was first awarded by GSA, there really was not an on-ramping and off-ramping capability. And so that was a problem for us, for the Army. And so we put pressure on them and also said that we'll write our own OASIS contract so that we would have on-ramping and off-ramping capabilities kind of built in. So if a company either didn't know that there was a big solicitation on the street or chose not to respond to it, so they missed out on getting an award in OASIS, now they have an opportunity to on-ramp. In other words, we're going to have another source selection to on-ramp. So the on-ramping, I think, is really important, but the off-ramping also. So if you have a company that has not received any task orders because they're priced too high or past performance issues or whatever, then we can also off-ramp. So, so I think that's an important part of these larger MATOCs.
I was just going to make a couple of general comments about the discussion here. I think one of the things from an industry perspective, you got to think about the amount of investment we have. I mean, we have we have a limited amount of dollars that we can spend and head count of people that can do it. So we have to pick and choose which MATOCs we're on. And often, some of these are 10-year, and you said longer type contracts, and so they often tend to change. So you get on one and you think it's going to be used a certain way, and then you find out the tasks that come out are slightly different or whatever. So often I think we in industry end up kind of doubling down, or you have to compete to get on it, and then you have to compete for task orders. And oftentimes these task order competitions are equally as hard as a full and open competition. So I think some of the benefits of the MATOCs kind of go away depending on how the task orders are written. So it's a challenge. I don't have an answer for you how to do that. I do think on-ramping and off-ramping is the way to keep it fair, and I think that's one way to hold industry accountable for participating in your procurements as well. And then I would just say, kind of for the longer contracts and longer task orders, if we're going to go to more strategic sources, it kind of goes to what Darren said in his opening. A lot of it is really about building a relationship. And as a contractor, if you know you're going to be there for a long time, you're investing in your own people and your own capability, not because you're a nice person, because it's good business, right? I mean, if you can build capability, then you can use that as a business reason to go elsewhere and to grow your company in other contracts. And I know I've been on some contracts that had a 3 or 4 year period, and you're just basically getting it done. Recently, some of the contracts with the Navy I'm on have gone to an 8-year period, and I can tell you, these are some lower-end O&M kind of facilities maintenance contracts. I'm actually putting more investment in those contracts than I did in some of my other ones with technology. We're beginning to use artificial intelligence to look at how we do predictive maintenance for facilities. And we wouldn't do that on a 2 or 3 or 4 year kind of task order because we don't get the return on investment. But I know I've got 8 years. I'm going to help that customer. It's going to improve my CPARs. We're going to lower costs for them. We're going to make better margin if it's fixed price. And then I'm going to use that capability to go elsewhere to sell and grow my business. So I do think there's great benefit to industry for longer contracts. I just think you got to be careful with some of these IDIQs that whatever their intended purpose is, it stays true to that and doesn't change over the 5 or 10 years, because then you end up causing a lot of churn in industry of getting on and getting off of these things.
So just a thought from the user's perspective, a MATOC contract is very important, right? It gives you access to support much quicker. It already has a determined time, and you already have a relationship. However, those things are important, but probably the most important to the user is the experience and the knowledge and the currency of both in order to enable that mission. So you will see in Tradoc, yes, I have MATOCs at every site, but I also have numerous other contracts because that MATOC does not always deliver all those component pieces, and I want to be able to go out and get different ideas and get creativity and innovation to come in and help us do our job better. So I think from the user perspective, yes, we rely on it, but we don't see every single piece of it, all of our work going down that path.
Okay, we'll switch gears. The next question is more related to LPTA, and it says, on many professional services contracts, the government appears to be claiming success by putting out FFP and FFP-LOE contracts and then almost always selecting the lowest bidder anyway. Many times, contractors lowball these knowing that they won't be held accountable. What's the government doing to disincentivize this behavior and hold companies accountable?
Okay, LPTAs, one of my favorite four-letter words. Is an LPTA really appropriate? I mean, Mr. Assad brought this up earlier, but is this really the appropriate vehicle for service contracts? If you can absolutely clearly define down to a T what it is that we're buying, then maybe it is. I will say that sometimes, depending upon the required activity, we'll have a best value contract, but the required activity, you ask them, well, what is it that you want to trade? And they don't know. So sometimes a best value actually kind of morphs into an LPTA at times. But I will tell you that there's been a big push for the last 4 years to really look at when we're going to use an LPTA and when we're not. To include legislation, and I think last year's NDAA touched on this. I'm sure that we still have some challenges out there, but I will also tell you that there's been a lot of emphasis through General Simpson and other contracting leaders to look very closely at what kind of contract vehicle and what we're trying to reinforce. I will tell you that for service contracts, I believe that LPTA drives us into the ground. And so we have to look very closely, especially when we cannot clearly articulate every aspect of what we're looking for.
I just shake my head when I think of LPTA, okay? I think that in the Army Contracting Command, I tell all of my people, before you think about the contracting vehicle, first of all, what is the output that you're trying to get to? Think about the output and then think about the right contracting vehicle. LPTA is just another contracting tool, but unfortunately it's a contracting tool that, as Mike just said, in some cases, and I'll just admit it, ACC has not used it appropriately, along with the requiring activity. We probably need to do a lot more training on LPTA versus other contracting tools that are out there, because when I go around and talking to people, the special industry, the biggest question I get is, when are y'all going to stop using LPTA? So it's a tool, but we have to know when to appropriately use LPTA. And I think that we have missed the ball on that one, okay? And I think not only ACC, but I think throughout the Army contracting enterprise, to be totally frank with you.
I'll give you a little more credit, General Simpson. I've seen a significant shift in the last 3 or 4 years away from LPTA. So as industry, I can really sense it. There was a period there where it got really bad, and some of us questioned, should we even be in some of these areas of work? Because it was really driving down wages, and we couldn't look our employees in the eyes and say, the only way we can win this job is to cut your personal salary by 20%. I mean, and it's just like that had gone too far. So I'll say I think the Army in particular has really swung the pendulum back to a much more balanced approach. I think the reality does come down to sometimes the requiring activities don't really define value, so it makes it really hard for contracting officers. I mean, everything kind of equalizes, and all you're left with is price. So it wasn't set out to be an LPTA, but it effectively becomes that. And so I think we got to put a little pressure on the requiring activities to really define value. And if they're looking for senior, experienced engineers, they need to be specific. If they just want an entry-level engineer, then they can be specific. So oftentimes what we see in the written RFP or in the performance work statement doesn't really match what the user really wanted. Oftentimes they want what they have, but sometimes that gets lost in translation. So I think we just got to be more clear and precise when we're writing the performance-based outcomes statements of work with the using activity, and try to help them define value. And then the source selection can make a best value decision. But if there's no value defined, then how do they make a trade-off?
Yeah, as the requirements guy, I absolutely agree. I mean, we need to do a better job writing requirements. And if it is about best value, and many of ours are, if I think about the future, and right now we still have the Army Capabilities Integration Center as Tradoc, and they're thinking about the future, I don't really need those, let me just have that new engineer. I really need somebody who can think about this topic in a very different way that we can bring in. And that's on us, but it's also on us collaborating with ACC and ensuring, as we're talking about those requirements and describing, that we're not being pushed one way, we're not being pushed to low price, but that we're working together and we're informed enough to be able to write that document in a way that will describe those different capabilities and what we would give up in order to get to that point. So I think it's an important concept we need to work on.
Go ahead.
So maybe just piggybacking on what you said, General, I'll use a Special Operations Command example. We do a tremendous amount of work there, and about 4 or 5 years ago, they let a multiple award service contract, and it was a de facto LPTA. And matter of fact, that 4-letter word probably showed up somewhere in the contract. And that has, you won't find a single person on industry or government side who says that was anything other than a challenge. And what happened in the primary, even when they got away from letting LPTA task orders and called them best value, the problem they had was that the users, the special operators, not only couldn't define, well, what is extra value, but the next part is even harder. How much is the extra value worth? Because if you know that I need a special unicorn special operator type, not just somebody coming out of school or something like that, that's one thing. But what is the quantitative value? And that's the question ultimately that a lot of the contracting folks have to assess. And I think it goes back to the comment I made earlier in my opening, is that there's a business acumen investment sort of thing that needs to be, I hate to add another curriculum to all the things that we have to do and learn, but I was talking with Don Merrick, who's the CTO effectively for the CIA, and she just commissioned a business acumen course that she's requiring all her S&T people to go through. And she's teaching them about business fundamentals and what drives industry and how we make ROI, return on investment decisions, but also how do you quantify that extra value so that you can really make sure that if you're buying the objective, not just the threshold requirement, you know what that's worth to you. And that's an upfront investment I think is really important.
Okay, thank you. The next question is addressed towards General Hoskin. What is the status of operationalizing DODI 5000.74 acquired services at the warfighter level to include internal controls associated with contractor management, standardized performance readiness, and linkage to readiness?
There's a lot. Okay, so we just published AR 7013, which is service contracts. I believe it was just signed in the last 30 days. And so that in that ARs are really written for the warfighters, and they live by them. And so doing a FAR or DFARs or AFARs is good for us internally, but to actually change the culture within the Army, we really needed to do this Army, update the Army regulation. So we're pushing forward. The 5000 series, some of my counterparts in these various acquisition reform groups are not only looking at the FAR and the DFARs, but they're looking at the 5000 series, also .74, and also the program management side of the house. So there is a lot of efforts underway. The Army has a service contract approval form, which is 22 pages, and that's an area that I believe we also need to look at. If I'm going to hire somebody for a week, I really need to fill out 22 pages of approvals. But that's kind of scratching that itch that there's a law in the book saying that we can't have personal service contracts except for in very specific fields like medical. And so this is kind of touching all of those points to ensure that we're not doing personal service contracts. So there's areas that I believe still need to be improved, and that's why I had that list of 9 reform activities up there. Within DASA-P, we actually have the Army's senior service manager, and that's a very small office, about 11 folks, that focus 100% on the service spend and our policies and procedures.
Okay, related to operationalizing contracting, this question says, how do we influence planners to better incorporate contract services into the deliberate planning process, op plans and con plans, to assist in identifying requirements earlier and ensure that government furnished services are included in the consideration?
This is an easy one. I should have wrote that one. Okay, so
it does have your name on the bottom. It's
no. Okay, so there's a term called OCS, or Operational Contract Support, and it's kind of important. Okay, so the Joint Staff J4 is kind of responsible for the doctrine and the policies and things like that. And they've revised their regs on this twice now. But quick story. So 5.5 years ago, we did a scrub of every operations plan, or every O plan, and every con plan across the Department of Defense. And I can't tell you the number, I'm sure it's classified, but it's a lot. And of that large number, only 2 of those con plans had a thing called Annex W. Annex W is the contracting annex within the overall big plan. And of those 2, when you looked at, so somebody went in there and wrote a contracting annex for the con plan to say, how are we going to support with non-organic, not people dressed up in uniform. And so those 2 are actually pretty darn good. But when you look at the logistics portion of that con plan, and you'll see, well, we're just going to contract for that. And we're just going to contract for that. Well, it's not. It wasn't tied to the Annex W. So that was about 5.5 years ago. Today, all of them have Annex Ws, and then they're tied to Annex Deltas, all of them, because there's been a full court press across the Department of Defense, led by the Joint Staff. They put together a course called JOPEC, which is the Joint OCS Planner course, and that course does a road trip around the world to each COCOM. It actually opens up plans and works them. So that actually has been kind of a success story over the last 4 or 5 years. A couple great examples. One great example is we got notified 10 hours before we had to fly into Liberia to fight Ebola. And we already had HADR, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief kind of plans in place in every one of the COCOMs. So we were able to, within hours, kind of dust it off, tailor it to Liberia and Senegal, and help a large part of the world eradicate Ebola in that part of Africa. Great news story.
Okay. How will the emergence of U.S. Army Futures Command impact the Army's contracting enterprise, and how is ACC helping to facilitate the stand-up of the command? I
get that question a lot. I do have people that are in Washington, well, going back and forth, that's been working with the Army Futures Command. I think Lieutenant General Cardone and his team in terms of helping them. I don't look at it as impacting the Army Contracting Command. What I looked at as probably complementing the Army Contracting Command, because the Futures Command, what they're looking at is getting war systems to our warfighters quicker, and that means that there should be better requirements. That means we can reduce our POT by working together with industry and so forth. So I look at this as not impacting, but as another command working with Army Contracting Command as a team here, doing things a lot better and a lot faster. But as Ms. Emerson said, the biggest struggle we got out there right now is defining the requirement. And that impacts all of you if we can't define the requirement. And if the Army Futures Command can help us with that, and we can get it to the Army Contracting Command, and we can get awarded a lot faster, that helps everybody, our warfighters downrange, and also our contracting partners.
Okay. Thanks. Is the federal acquisition skewed too much towards hardware acquisition, and if so, how should that be rebalanced? Well, to the panel.
Okay, so I guess it depends on where you sit. So are there more rules associated with a tank or an aircraft or a ship? Yeah, absolutely. Are there less rules on service contracting? Absolutely. Is that a bad thing? Maybe not. You know, sometimes having a lot of extra regulations and rules actually makes it a little bit more time-consuming and harder to get things done. So I believe that there's a balance. I think that the services should put a number of resources against managing and writing the policies and procedures for service contracts. Each service does it slightly different. The Air Force has a PEO for services. We have a senior service manager within ASALT. But I believe the services are pretty effective without adding a whole bunch of additional rules. Since the acquisition reform, we're actually trying to streamline.
Okay. Anybody else on that thought? All right, we'll just stay with you, Mike, and we'll come down the line for your closing thoughts.
Yeah, I guess first and foremost, AUSA, what a great organization. You know, this is my second panel in the last couple of years to participate and do things like this. I think it's important to reach out to industry. I did hear loud and clear, though, from industry with Mr. Parsons and a couple others in the last panel that this is not a good way to do one-on-one communication. I got a couple of business cards in my pocket. So once we finish here and we break for lunch, if industry wants to talk with us, let's go ahead and just set it up. Thank you.
So I think service contracting is unique, and while I don't think the system is skewed necessarily one way or the other, because there are some more flexibilities in the service contracting realm, I do think we, as humans, tend to try to apply a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's just human nature, and we have to fight against that. And I think relative to service contracting, we do try to apply those product weapon system ideas towards service contracting, and where that typically falls apart is because it's people. People always tend to screw things up, and I mean, you know, just that's who we are, right? And so I think when you're talking about contracting for people, that's just a different animal altogether, and we need to recognize where those things are different and make sure that we're creating the right environment for those people to really relish in the opportunity to support the warfighter.
Yeah, thank you, AUSA, for the opportunity. I agree. It's really, in the services world, it's about people, and that was kind of my theme. It's about people on the government side. It's protecting our contracting officers. It's giving them the tools and resources, and it's also protecting the employees of commercial companies. ensuring that we're giving them the right incentives and work environments to be the best they can be, because we have the best Army in the world, and it's on the backs of our soldiers and our people and our industry partners, and ensuring that we're attracting and retaining the best talent that we want to stay in the Army, whether that's a contractor or a government civilian, I think is just critical to our future success.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, AUSA, for the opportunity. I think that, from that user perspective, one last time, what are we trying to get out of service contract reform? We were trying to get out improved contract outcomes. And the way that we do that is from our little triad, right? We're going to do a good job on requirements. We're going to get timely, viable contracts in place. And we're going to have early and continued engagement with industry. That will bring success to the process.
Exactly.
And as Ms. Emerson said, it's all about success. As a commander of the Army Contractor Command, I've had the privilege of traveling all over the world, about 105 locations, where I got about 6,300 people. 9 CSBs supporting the COCOM commanders. They do service contracts a little bit differently in terms of some of them don't use strategic sourcing vehicles, depending on where they're at and the vendor base they got there, okay? It just depends. And then we got the MIC and 32 CONUS-based locations that depend a lot on small businesses around the Fort Campbells of the world and the Fort Drums of the world. And then I got these huge centers. One of them at Redstone with 900 people sitting in a contracting center. Huge. That do a lot of work, do with service contracts. So it just depends on where you sit. But let me say this about service contracts. That drives our Army. And your support drives our Army. Our sons and daughters cannot do what they're doing on the front lines without your support. And I've had the privilege of being deployed now 3 different times. And I thank you for your support, and I know they thank you. And again, General Ham and the AUSA team, thank you for inviting me back, and thank you for what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just wrap this up. First, thanks to the panel for your preparation and for your thoughtful comments. And I don't want to single anybody out, but I think it is appropriate to thank General Simpson for his leadership and command of ACC. So first, thanks to the panel. Second, thanks to AUSA for hosting this, and to all of you for your attention and your thoughtful questions. And then finally, I like to close the way I always do. We talked a lot about processes and contracting, but as General Simpson said in his remarks, service contracting and contracting reform is all about accelerating S&T to facilitate lethal modernization, enabling readiness for our soldiers deployed downrange, and for supporting and taking care of our soldiers and families in our garrisons all across the world. And it's to those soldiers and families that we focus, and that's what this is all about. So thank you, and thanks again to the panel.